and standard engagement and transformation, and is the principal investigator of two National Science Foundation grants. Her focus is professional development for interdisciplinary and inclusive STEM teaching and learning. And Dr. Joseph Snyderwide is dedicating his career to teaching math and science and opening STEM to students with disabilities. So we are very curious, very anxious to learning something very particular from you. Okay, so today they are going to speak us about hidden in plain sight student with disability in STEM education. So the stage is yours, please.
Thank you so much. And we really got lucky with a fabulous group. So we're enjoying these other sessions. Welcome. We'd love to hear from you in the chat. So if you, I know you introduce yourselves by name, but if you can even say what institution you're at, if you didn't do that yet, that would be great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. So thank you for the introductions. Joe, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that in particular, I mean, my picture's on the left there, so I do have a pretty personal and I am really interested in this topic for personal reasons. So that was kind of what drew me to it in the first place.
Yes. Awesome. Thank you. And there's our Twitter hashtags as well. And so if anyone wants to connect that way as well. It's a little slow to click the slides. Let's see.
Yeah, also the connection. There are some problems, but okay.
Yes. So we do need to acknowledge that we have, we're grateful for our funding from National Science Foundation.
So the framework of this problem that we're addressing here today is I started looking at the subject of students with disabilities in STEM, like I said, for kind of personal reasons. But when I was looking at it, I kind of noticed a lack of literature, at least lack of easily accessible literature on the topic, which kind of led to what we termed the invisibility of students with disabilities in STEM education. So the first issue that we looked at is the general absence of disability from the educator equity lens in the United States. When we encountered the term equity or equality, disability in general seems to be missing from that discussion. The other component to it is that it's hard to determine and address the degree of underrepresentation of these students when they are so invisible within this equity lens. And I'll discuss that a little bit more in a few minutes.
So again, we're speaking in a U.S. context, but what we found is that attention to disability is largely constrained to the silos of special education and disability studies, and the underrepresentation of students with disabilities in STEM is, it makes it invisible with the statistics, the lack of statistics that Joe mentioned. And in the U.S., they call it, general education as opposed to special education. We also, part of this work is really motivated, as Joe said, out of personal objectives, but we want to recognize there are, of course, need for changes at the individual classroom level, but what we're really motivated to do is help to transform systems and inform policies that address the need for far more inclusion of students with disabilities particularly in STEM fields. And we're hoping that you all have some good ideas for us. So when we started this work, we began to theorize about why disability is relatively invisible in, quote unquote, general education, in STEM fields, and also in educational equity. And we find that the disciplinary silos are very problematic in terms of addressing this inequity. So we've been reviewing the research and practitioner literature. We've begun to publish some kind of blog style publications on syntheses of what we found. And what we've noticed in the US is that people with disabilities have very distinct experiences as children under 18 versus as adults under our legal frameworks. And again, we're interested to hear if other folks are willing to share any perspectives on that. So we've been working very hard from the base of the Noyce Scholarship Program that we're both involved with to host some student-led work, undergraduate student-led work, panels and discussions, and developing ways to try to exchange information, exchange resources. That's really, we found that to be lacking. And so we've also begun to collect primary data with the hope of creating a research collective among students and teachers to analyze the data and help disseminate the findings. So we have an online survey. It's not limited to, it is only for adults. It's not limited to STEM fields, but that is how we have kind of marketed the survey, is because of the field that we are doing, and also because of the troubling disparities in the STEM fields in this area. And so the survey asked adults, to briefly report on if and how their disability shapes their experience in the workplace. And then also asked them to report back on if and how their disability shaped their K-12 schooling experience. And so that is what we're going to be sharing with you today, is that piece, the K-12 schooling. So we're going to share some of our preliminary findings. This survey is still open, so we're early on. And so we're interested to see the ways our data compares to what you're seeing in your contexts. And we're hoping we can have some good connections either within our time today or in an ongoing fashion. We have set up a Padlet where we can exchange kind of resources. And so I will put that in the chat.
So these preliminary findings that we're looking at are taken from the survey that we had mentioned, or that Dr. Johnson had mentioned. And I apologize for the small numbers and the words on the graphs here. But the graph on the left asks individuals whether or not they received services for disabilities in K-12 education. For that, about 4 times as many said no, they did not. Now, this can either indicate that the onset of disability was after secondary education, so after K-12 education. Otherwise, it can indicate that maybe no, they did not receive any accommodations, even though they were diagnosed. I don't necessarily think that that is the case, because in the US, it is federal law that students must receive accommodations if they are diagnosed. But that becomes kind of problematic when there are different issues, like parents can say yes or no to whether they want their own children to receive accommodations. And there are a whole bunch of issues with that as well. It's kind of an established bias around individuals with disabilities, and I think that's an issue that deserves attention as well. But again, these are just numbers that kind of point us into different directions that should be looked at. The graph on the right was asking individuals who did receive services how well those services met their needs. And so it's rated extremely well, very well, moderately well, slightly, or not at all. The interesting point with this one is about 50% of respondents said moderately well. The rest said not very well. None of the respondents said that their needs were met extremely well or very well. So that's another interesting issue that kind of points at something new to look at as well.
So we used grounded theory to code the survey respondents' open-ended responses as well. And these are the 3 initial themes that have emerged. And we are going to be sharing the latter 2 with you.
So one of the respondents in this did receive services in the earlier grades, and interestingly enough, was talking about the humiliation and low expectations of students with disabilities. So this has an impact on what individuals later in life will respond to with disabilities. And so this kind of goes to what I was kind of speculating at as a bias, or how individuals will self-identify after this schooling stage, that if individuals experience humiliation and low expectations in these early years of life, then maybe they won't have any motivation to self-identify with disabilities later in life, which again is another problematic thing that needs to be addressed.
And I'm going to read this to you. This is another one under the segregation theme. So my K-12 school system struggled with supporting, respecting, and believing that I could have a learning disability and be a successful student. This was particularly true in terms of my interests to take advanced courses in science, math, and English. Regular education and special education teachers, as well as special education administrators, openly discouraged me or prevented me from being in certain classes. And we hear this person describing being tracked away from more challenging classes because of the teacher's low expectations. And this is a person who, we're able to hear from now, and who ended up being academically successful.
So a good majority of the respondents to our survey did recognize that, at least in early years of school, they had been underserved. So this first quote we have here is, "I needed accommodations, but didn't know what accommodations were available or how to get them. Neither did my parents, so we never pursued them." And this might have been an individual who was either diagnosed after this early schooling, or who had an onset of disability afterwards. So if they were not led in a direction of knowing what services they could request, there is very little to kind of prompt them to know what accommodations were even available to help out. So my question for you all, and my experience with literature search, at least most of the literature that I was able to find was very theoretical in nature if it came from the US. All of the research-based papers that I was able to find about individuals with disabilities came from countries outside of the US. So my question is, what are some systemic changes that we can advocate for? Because these are changes that could help pretty much all students probably, but in specific, students with disabilities might need some help. So what are some changes that we can advocate for? What are some systems that you know are in place that have been helpful in your school systems?
Mhm. I'm seeing some good responses coming in the chat, which is great. And I also want to encourage you all to uh, check out that Padlet that's linked in the chat, because this would be a way for you to share some of these perspectives. We'd really like to hear from you. It would be very helpful. And the link to the survey is in there as well. And so again, this is for adults with disabilities to take. And so if you, if this would be appropriate for you to take it, or for you to distribute with your networks, we would really appreciate it. So thank you so much.
Thank you to you, because it's a really an important topic, and yes, I think the low expectation are terrible things also in the normal condition. And so this is, I think, one of the worst things that can happen to a student. So I can imagine also the disaster that can cause in a person that also have to face everyday disability. So I think it's really important also to speak about this topic. And I have one question. If okay, I'm seeing that other people maybe are writing, but anyway, in this short time, I'd like to ask if teachers are in some way trained to face, to listen, to open a more dialogue with this student, because I think also this aspect has to be taken into consideration. So also train the teachers to face this kind of condition. I don't know. Okay, I think also this depends of the country. So how is the situation in the United States?
And there are some exceptions, but generally speaking, there's general education and special education. So people can, you know, be specialists in special education, and they do all of their coursework in that area. But for general education teachers, like Joe, for example, he's a future math teacher. They take one class in special education, which is far short of preparing them to be inclusive of all their students' needs. And so this is why when we talk about the silos, there's really that need to break down those silos, because it's hurting our students.
Yeah. Yes, it's difficult. Yes, so there is a lot of work to do, I think.
A lot of work, yes.
A huge work.
Yes.
Guys, there is a lot of work to do, but we have to keep going and push, because it's important for the future generation and also for the adults. And yes, okay, so time is running so fast. So now we have to thank you very much for this discussion. And okay, we can go on. Okay, with the next speaker, that is